All right, happy Wednesday night, everybody. It is your host, Wes Seiler, with the Berkin Conservative, and I am so happy to be joining you on another episode of our show. And I love doing this. It's our chance to be able to talk directly. So if you're watching live, hit me with a comment. Let me know that you're watching, and we're going to have a pretty interesting discussion because today has been a pretty wild day with what's been going on in D.C. If you've been watching the news, you've probably seen that. So we're going to go through it. We're going to talk about it a lot, but let me know what is going through your mind as we get into the impeachment trial as that's ongoing. Any other issues that you want to talk about tonight? I've gotten a couple emails this week for folks asking my opinion in terms of what I think. There's been Mike Pence has been in the news recently with some things that he is doing, which is kind of exciting to see him starting to get involved in podcasting and doing shows as well. And then, of course, I think we've got to do an entire show on Biden's executive orders. I thought about doing that tonight because there's been so many and a lot of them polarizing, but just an unprecedented amount of action from the Oval Office without Congress. So we've got to get into that at some point. But with the impeachment trial, I felt like we had to do that tonight. So let me know what your thoughts are as we go through this, because this is really our topic. I mean, this is the question that Congress is looking into right now, and of course, like in some sense, we look at this and we're like, why does it matter? Because Trump is out of office, but they're pressing on with this impeachment trial. We're going to go through some of the facts on this show. We're going to look at where they are. We're going to look at the likelihood of whether or not they're going to convict, the standards that they're supposedly using on this. But ultimately, you've got to ask yourself this question: is everybody's familiar with the riots and what happened? The 5 people that were killed, all the damage that was done, just the chaos that ensued that day. But then the question becomes, was Trump responsible? Obviously, many of the people who were involved in that have faced legal action afterwards. But how much of that do you actually tie back to Donald Trump himself? And that really is the question that Congress is occupying themselves with. And I think it's a question for conservatives as well, is as we look forward in our movement, who is going to be leading this movement? Is there still a space for Trump in, say, 2024 to run again, for his kids to be able to run for office? I've heard that they could be looking to run for Senate in different states, things like that. Or is this party going to change? There was a big divide between Trump and Pence during what happened that day. Do we see a split? That's entirely possible. So, kind of getting to this question, I think, is not just important for Congress, but I think it's also important for us. So, let's get into it, though. But before I do that, I get the question all the time of how do I look at Donald Trump versus, say, Edmund Burke, who we base our channel on. I'm a Burkean conservative, but am I a Trump conservative? And we have had people on our show so many times who are Trump supporters and big advocates of his. And then we've also had people on the show who are not, who don't even want to talk about that. And I want to show you I've released this graphic that you see right here. And I'm going to go through that really quickly. There's a lot to it. But the whole reason I did this graphic was because I wanted to answer that question. How can you have George Will on your page, who's very anti-Trump? He and Trump hate each other. And at the same time, you have other people like Rick Green, who's a big Trump supporter. I've even had people on our page who've written books about Trump and how much they like him and how they support him. And people ask, well, where do I stand? And this is it, because I think it's got to be more complicated than simply, oh, I'm for him or I'm against him. If you're in that point, you tend to be, especially for those that are against him, they tend to be very extreme. And people who support Trump, some of them vote for him, and they may have some objections. Some of them, everything he does is perfect. And so where do most of us sit? And this is how I did it, is I spent several weeks thinking about what are the key principles that Trump follows, right? And then what are the key principles that Edmund Burke followed during his lifetime? What were their thoughts on human nature? How did they view government? How did they see progress in life. And when you look at it from this point, and again, there's a lot of words on this screen, but when you look at it from this point, there actually is a lot of overlap between Donald Trump and between Edmund Burke. And I'll give you some examples. If you look at those key principles, political incorrectness was something that Donald Trump, that was like the beginning of his candidacy when he was in Republican debates. Burke at times was very politically incorrect. He, as an Englishman or an Irishman in English Parliament, he often favored the Americans during the American Revolution and said that Great Britain shouldn't be invading America. And that was very politically incorrect. A lot of people hated him for that, but he believed that they shouldn't be doing that. And he was willing to take stands that at the time were politically incorrect. Edmund Burke was against slavery. And at the time, that's what so many people were doing. We could go through this list, if people wanted me to. But what I want to show you is the notion that as you look at Donald Trump, he's a pretty complicated guy. He's in his entire movement has a lot of pros to it. There's a lot of things that it has brought conservatism, and it does have some negatives. It does have some cons to it, and so it's got to be more complicated than just a yes or a no. And that's what this graphic is. And so as I look at Donald Trump and what he's done, I almost always try to do so with an open mind, objective, and try not to simplify it. There are things that Trump does that I agree with, and there are things that he does that I disagree with. And I don't want to let one particular action overshadow another. And so that's how I approach it. And I always try to see the good in what someone is doing, and the effects of what they do. And if there's a positive, we should appreciate that before we get to the negative. So I don't treat Trump any differently than I would treat any other leader, frankly. And there are plenty of things to like and plenty of things to not like. And so that's how I do it. And that's what hopefully you'll get out of this show. When we look at what's going on in D.C., we're going to go through some of the legal stuff. You see, I'm bringing it up here. But what I don't see is many people treating it very objectively. I think they are pressing on the basis of political grounds, retribution, pre-existing notions, things that Trump has done in the past that they're either celebrating or angry about, and not all looking at the facts as clearly as they should. So let's look at those facts. And that's what I'm going to walk you through here in the next 5 minutes or so. So most people are aware this is the second impeachment of Trump, the first time that's ever happened to a leading official, much less a president. So it's the second time that he's been impeached. The way it works is the House impeaches and then the Senate has to convict in order for it to actually remove someone from office. And of course, in the case of Trump, he's already out of office, which leads to the question, why are they doing this? And it's to keep him from running in 2024 or to make a statement of how much Democrats and others don't want him to be around. So that's really why they're doing this. So you look at the state of the impeachment process. The House has already voted to impeach on the 13th of January, so almost a month ago. And the charge is important. And this, they don't always cover, but we are going to cover in detail tonight. The charge that the Democrats were able to stick on Trump is that during the Capitol riots, they have tried to label Trump as inciting an insurrection. So that really is the charge that the House has handed over to the Senate, which is, of course, considering it today. So the Senate has affirmed the constitutionality of this process. You may have heard different news personalities or thinkers or leaders or influencers trying to tell you that impeachment is unconstitutional. The Senate had a vote on that, and they affirmed that it was constitutional. So there was a chance there that they wouldn't even be able to press. But there was a precedent for this. There's been times where people have been impeached or convicted after they have left office, and it's been decades and decades ago. But there was enough precedent there that many senators affirmed that, and now that trial is ongoing. So I watched some of it today. I watched the videos that was played by the different lawyers and the representatives who were arguing for impeachment conviction. And I suggest you watch it because, it had all kinds of footage from the riots and things like that. None of it really surprised me because as that day was happening, there was already so much content that came out, so much footage that came out. But you see it from many different angles, and they put it together in a way that kind of walks you through where Trump was at the time. So pretty interesting stuff. Looks like we got our first comment here, and I always love getting these. So looks like the comment was the House impeachment managers made a compelling case. I heard that too. I heard that they definitely played on the emotions. They had, I believe, the representative was talking about how his kids never want to be in D.C. again because it's forever tainted by what happened, and of course their video was just showing walking you through the facts. I've heard that Trump's folks, I saw comments from Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz who weren't particularly happy with their stance on the issue, how they were trying to respond and how they need to build their case a little bit better. But even if they don't, there's many reasons to be skeptical that this is going to go forward, just being honest with you. But you're right. They did make a compelling case but I think that their case was mainly that this was a horrible event, which almost everyone I know agrees with that take. That this really was something that we all regret and lament. And I think they were just showing how horrible it was. I heard feedback from it saying that different senators were upset. Senator Langford from Oklahoma, because he was up there speaking right when he got ushered off because they were worried about his safety. That you can understand there's an emotional reaction. I mean, when I think of different things in my life, if you were go back to a place where you were endangered, if you've ever been robbed or harassed or bullied, or in my case, I have thoughts about Afghanistan. If I see it on the news, it's not just a foreign country for me; it's the place that I've been. I spent time in southern Ukraine, and when I saw it switch over to Russia and all these rioters and things like that, I recognized the place on TV, and I was like, all these emotions came back. So there was an emotional case in this, but I wonder how much of it is actually a legally binding or convincing case. That's what we're going to get into. A couple more comments here and you have to let me know your first name, Mr. or Miss Henderson. You said that you watched much of it. At the very least, you can see a clear link between Trump and his supporters before and during the insurrection, and that you agree that the case is unlikely to produce a conviction. Yeah, that's you kind of getting ahead of where I'm going, but I think we think very similarly because just because there may be a link, and I think there is, does that necessarily mean that there's going to be a conviction? So let's get into that, and then we'll talk about that link at the end. I'm bringing you back to the language here, incitement of insurrection. So, many of the people who were violent during this time have had to face criminal charges. There were people who had pipe bombs and different types of explosives that they wanted to send to the Republican and Democratic headquarters. Those people are facing charges, and they can blame whoever they want, but they're facing individual charges for what they did. The charge against Trump is incitement of insurrection. And I put this in a highlighted background in blue because everything that I have read legally over the past several days says that this is almost impossible to prove. And I've got some stuff for you to Google if you want to take a look at this more, because the language here of incitement is difficult to prove, as well as what constitutes insurrection. So if you incite someone to do something, how do you prove that? How do you prove that they did it on the basis of your influence alone? You could have had people who were just looking for a fight. You could have had people who projected a lot of their anger from their personal life onto politics. There's all kinds of things that go into how a person makes a decision that are very, very psychoanalytical and difficult to prove. Insurrection, what constitutes an insurrection against government, can be difficult. So if you look up the Brandenburg test, this was the definition for incitement, and it's almost impossible. The ACLU uses this to protect all kinds of speech, because you think about our history in our country, and freedom of speech is so often protected. That is our first inclination of Americans, is to allow people to speak their minds. And if they're going through something, to be able to say that to whomever they want. And do those rights end if you're the president of the United States? And so the Brandenburg test is used in legal considerations to err on the side of freedom of speech over a definitive link of someone says this, then someone else does it. And so there's that going against these charges of impeachment and conviction against Trump, as well as the Bundy revolt. So take a look at this: 2014 and 2016. This was a guy and his son who took up armed resistance against the United States government, and the assumption is that they were going to be convicted on the basis of insurrection. And even in these cases where they themselves took up weapons against the United States government, insurrection did not stick. And so if you have someone who's literally threatening police officers with guns on their own, and they're not convicted of insurrection, how then could you possibly convict Trump on this in terms of insurrection when he hasn't done that, nor did he tell people to do specifically that in terms of taking up arms? He said things like fight the election, stop the steal, those type of things. But did he tell them specifically to take up weapons? And even if he did, is it going as far as the Bundy revolt? Because that in itself wasn't far enough to be considered insurrection. So it's almost impossible to prove the language that they have. And then I want to kind of get into my take on this, because here's where we get into the morality of the entire situation, of one person being responsible for someone else's decisions, right? And it's a very, very slippery notion, because what we don't want to undermine is, and the law protects this thought, that people are responsible for their own actions, right? Just because someone is suggesting or recommending or even telling you to do something does not mean that you did it because they said those things. You still had a process of consideration, and then you move to be able to make those decisions. So if someone that I respect greatly influences me, then how then, right, can we get to a point where that influence takes priority over my own conscience and the things that I do, right? Is it starts to undermine this notion of equality before the law. And with this is this slippery notion of political support. So going back to one of the comments that we had before, which was one of our followers saying that there's a link between Trump and his supporters before and during the insurrection. How strong is that link? Because these weren't people who worked for Trump, right? If you look at the backgrounds on many of these people, they were folks who loved to attend political rallies. Some of them were retired military folks or retired cops, or retired in general, folks that had worked for many years and basically essentially had the time to be involved in these type of things. But that at the same time, they're not being paid. They're not part of the Trump organization. And they don't ultimately answer to the president himself any more than any one of us do as individual citizens. So their link to Trump is more one of ideology and belief system than it is, for example, if Trump had sent soldiers to go to the Capitol, if he had sent members of the administration to go and do this. Essentially what you had happen here was people who believe the things that Trump is saying took those matters into their own hands. He said, let's go to the Capitol. They had a choice. They could have said, you know what? No, I'm going to go home, right? I don't want to do this anymore. Or they could have just stayed there at the White House at Pennsylvania Avenue where Trump was. Or they could have gone onto the Capitol. And then further, once they got there, they could have taken armed resistance, which many of them did. But all of those actions are choices that they made or did not make based upon their individual conscience, no matter how much they bought into things that Trump was saying. As opposed to, if my boss tells me, hey, Wes, I want you to go do this or you're going to lose your paycheck. I am ordering you to do this because I'm over you. Then all of a sudden, there is this notion of, well, my choice doesn't matter as much because I'm being directed to do this by someone who is legally over me. And in this country, the president is not over anyone because they are a representative of the people who is elected to do their will. And so that, I think, is where this all starts to fall apart, is this notion that Trump incited an insurrection. He did not lead people of his administration. He did not send the National Guard in to attack the Capitol. He did not order this type of thing to happen. Could he have influenced it? Of course he did. People were chanting his name. People were saying, I'm doing this because of Trump. But again, they are the ones doing it. And whether they draw it from him or not is something that is so hard to prove at a level that would actually tie them back to Trump himself as an individual, that I just don't see this going forward from an objective sense. So that doesn't change the fact that this trial is ongoing. And I'll get to these last thoughts in a second, but it doesn't change the notion of this trial and what we are seeing. And that kind of leads us to the political grounds of why this is happening. So let me get to some of your comments before we finish this kind of thing out. So, Miriam, I guess you were surprised by a couple of things that I said. So let me know what that is, because if I'm off, I want to hear from you about that. But maybe there's some new information that I provided, or you see things differently. So I want to hear that. Antonia, you said at the end of the day, people need to get real, man. You're responsible for your own actions. Period. Dot. Yeah, that was kind of my point. That was my point. Is at the end of the day, we're not children. We are adults who make decisions. And if someone is just so angry that they get to the point that they make really, really dumb decisions, ultimately that's on them. That's on them. We cannot lose that notion of freedom of conscience. And then you said they just don't want him to run for office again. That's all this is. I don't know what anyone says. Anything and I mean anything to see this man out and in Norfolk good. Yeah, I mean, if this was truly a legal case, I think you'd have to have something stronger than incitement of insurrection. And so many people have voted for that simply because, they were horrified at what happened. But the legal grounding, I think, is where they're going to ultimately lose it. They need 17 Republican senators to vote for conviction. And I don't think they're going to get that. I think you're going to get Ben Sasse, possibly Mitt Romney, a few others, but I seriously doubt they're going to get enough. And the legal grounding on this, again, is where it starts to fail. Miriam said, great recap. I appreciate that. They don't want him to have the title. And that's what I see. And that ultimately gets back to, what is the future? What is the future of conservatism? What is the future of the Republican Party? And that's kind of the broader question of where do we go from here? And those are my final thoughts. So as we kind of close this topic out, here are two things that I would urge you to think about. Is one, we have to chart a path to a restoration of faith in elections and American institutions, because the link between Trump supporters, Republicans, and Trump himself is that everybody feels this anger and this distrust at the electoral process. And there are reasons to feel that way. There's fraud that happens in every single election. We all felt it. There was this jump from, hey, what's going on with this election, to let's not ask any questions, right? And in many cases, this came from the same people who were raising questions for years after Trump was initially elected about Russian influence and those type of things, and investigating that. But it seemed like after a few weeks in the election, all those questions were forbidden by the left. And I did not think that was fair. If you have been watching this show for a while, I was very, very slow to be able to agree with the news media calling different states. I could not believe that they called Georgia so quickly, Arizona so quickly. I was like, this is going to take time. When we get to a point where you're shutting off questions and inquiries, that's not a good thing. So how do we get to a point where we restore faith in elections? And I think there needs to be specific actions that are taken. Certainly there was actions taken after the Russian interference in 2016. Robust actions were taken in the social media world and government to prevent that kind of thing from happening again. What do we do to prevent election fraud in places like Pennsylvania, specifically in Philadelphia, where there's a history of that, both at the state and local level, and then, of course, in the federal level? And the states certify the results, remember. So if there's a state with a corrupt past when it comes to elections, How do we prevent that from happening again? What's being done to do that? Where's the solutions for that? Those are things that we have to wrestle with as conservatives, because when you get to a point where you have no faith whatsoever in elections, then where are you supposed to go? And I think that's where so many people were at in this riot, is they were just so angry that this institution had been destroyed in front of them, and that the Supreme Court and Mike Pence seemingly were not going to defend it. And so they resorted to violence. It doesn't excuse what they did, but how do we give them something better? Because the court system, the electoral college, are cherished American institutions that have never been perfect, but that are far better than the opposite of violence. Um, Rage is never the answer. When you get to a point where you're acting as violently as these people got, whether it's on the left or on the right, it's never the answer. So we have to do better. We have to find better ways to be able to conduct elections that don't end in this craziness. And then two, we must use power and influence responsibly. We need to be able to look for solutions on this. And in that case, I do think Trump could have done better. I think their hindsight is 2020, but I think he could have chose his words better. He could have been more clear about what he meant about fighting. There are ways to fight for integrity in elections. There are ways to fight for a better review of processes. I mean, in this entire process, COVID was huge. And should the election have been delayed while they figured out processes for COVID? Because if you've experienced it in your own life, you know that there's still so many questions about COVID and being able to trust tests and quarantines and vaccines and so many things like that, that doing an election in the midst of it, we knew was going to be a train wreck. Life is a train wreck in the age of COVID, and we're just starting to come out of it. And so there is a need to do that, but that does not, in my mind, make Trump responsible for what other people did. Maybe irresponsible in terms of some of the things that he said. What else is new? But not necessarily responsible to the point of conviction. So I don't see the legal grounding for it. And again, like I said, with this show, I try to call it like I see it. I try to be objective as possible. But I think it's pretty shaky legal ground. So let me get to your final comments, and then we'll call it a night. So it looks like we got two more that came through. So Antonia said, off topic, the indoctrination has begun. Have I seen the SecDev memos and pushes? I've seen a couple of them, Antonia. I've seen some talk about, essentially calling anybody who believes that the election wasn't perfect as a right-wing extremist, that type of thing. And I think we've got to be careful. Well, we're going to do entire shows on the Biden administration and how many executive orders he's pushed out, his cabinet appointees, and frankly, how little compromise or moderation I see in that. No questions allowed in the White House press. Yeah, that's not a good thing. And Antonia said as well, I'm frankly scared of this blind loyalty and sudden call for so-called unity, the censorship, elimination of free speech. The sheep, they follow the science tax from the government or government-sponsored scientists. Clear slant and unjustifiably slant ownership of our country's media and social media. It is totally understandable why people are pissed off and distrustful. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to having this Sunday. We'll have Chris and Kyle back on the show, and I've got a lot of questions for Chris because there are ways that Biden could have pursued a more unifying strategy. And one of my favorite people, and I'd love to get him on this show, is Andrew Yang, who ran for president in the Democratic Party, but he did so with an understanding of where Trump supporters came from and the legitimate grievances against them. Tulsi Gabbard has started to warm up to that a little bit lately, and I don't see that. A great example is Pete Buttigieg, who was being questioned by Ted Cruz as he gets into his job, and he was talking environmental policy, and Ted Cruz asked him, if you're shutting down all these jobs and you want green jobs to come, what would you tell people who are losing their job? And Pete said, well, just go get an environmentally clean one. And that is entirely disrespectful to people who've worked in an industry, because very few companies are going to hire somebody who essentially has worked their way up in that industry and needs whole new training and all of that, versus someone who just graduated college that they can invest in for decades to come. And if you don't have any transition or an assistance for that person to be able to switch their job, then how can you expect them to compete with younger folks who don't have all of the background in a completely different way of doing the job. And he had no answer for that because Ted Cruz actually brought that up. And that's what I mean. That's the kind of disrespect we see to people whose jobs are struggling. So that's, and then we talked about the 1776 project versus the 1619 project. And of course, Biden shut down what the Trump administration had set up, as opposed to having these two projects work together to be able to talk to one another, which was our last show that we did. So yeah, it's an interesting future that we're going to get into. But I'm at least excited to see that there are some leaders out there. And again, I mentioned two on the liberal side. There's plenty on the conservative side who are open and advocating for something better than what we're seeing. But ultimately, when you set aside all of the legal background on this, the objective analysis, everything that I've done, and you look at this from a political standpoint, which ultimately is what this conviction is, I do not think it's a smart strategy at all for the Democrats, because if you start to push so far to the left with all these executive orders, with this type of conviction that doesn't have very strong legal backing, then you start to prove everything that Trump has been saying correct about the liberals being extremist on the left, and that is simply going to lead to a backlash from moderates back towards the right. And so essentially, if they continue on this ground, within a less than 2 years, you're going to have another election, and they could easily start losing the offices that they just gained. Whereas if they had approached this with a more moderating stance and put people like Andrew Yang and Tulsi and others in positions of authority, I think that you could have had some middle ground. You could have had some things. You could have, if they had taken the election fraud charges more seriously, then you possibly could have a better outlook for Democrats. But I don't see that. Well, it'll be interesting to get Chris's take on this. Anyone else who wants to give me that, I'd love to hear it. So, hey, thank you all. Antonio, you got the last comment that you said that this is not going to unify the country at all. And I agree with that, but hey, that's why we have a show. So that's why we do this, because we want to be able to give people a place to be able to have those conversations and to be able to prove what right looks like. So we do that every Wednesday on our podcast. I loved all the comments. Looks like we ultimately got about 20. So I appreciate everyone that watched live. We do this every Wednesday. If you've got a topic you want me to get into next Wednesday, then just shoot me a message. Let me know. Be happy to do that. On Sundays, we do our two other shows. We do Refounding Fathers, where we have a liberal and a libertarian, and I get to take them to task. And then we have Conservatism on Tap, which is a lot of fun. We're up to, I think, 3 to 4 different guys that we have on that show every Sunday. And that's where we get to kind of rehash some of these things, but with many more perspectives than just me. So take a look at those shows. Don't forget our website, The Bergen Conservative. YouTube, you can subscribe. Instagram, Twitter, and then, of course, Facebook. We're on there all the time. So thank you so much for all the comments, all the feedback. Let me know what you thought of the show, and I will see you